Hi everybody! You may think, yet another EQ video. I have seen so many of those. But I promise you, I will have a couple of techniques and tips that you may not have seen before, so stay tuned. Alright, before we start with the more advanced EQing techniques, I just want to give a little walkthrough, a little introduction into what an EQ actually is and what it does. So if you know all the basics already, you can jump to the next chapter where we start with the more advanced stuff. But just in case we have some viewers that maybe never have worked with an EQ or don't really know what it is, or maybe never have done something with audio and just starting out, I'm just giving you like a brief introduction into what an EQ is. Well, basically an EQ, an equalizer, is a tool with which you can manipulate frequency ranges. So for example, add more brilliance by adding more high frequencies, or removing boominess out of a sound by removing some low frequency, and everything in between. It's really a very powerful tool, and it's one of the essential tools when you are mixing music. So now what we're going to do is I have a little piece of music that we can use to demonstrate how different EQ moves sound like, and then I'm going to walk you through, I think, the three most common types of EQs that are used like 90% of the time, so that you get a basic understanding of what these tools are doing, and then you can start to try and experiment with it and get some kind of learning curve going. Okay, let's have a look at one plugin EQ. I chose to show you this with FabFilter Pro Q3 because this is kind of an industry standard plugin. It has all the features that an EQ could have, so it's really nice to demonstrate it with this. Now, when I play some music that is running through this plugin, this is what it looks like. So we have an analyzer built in, which can be really handy sometimes if you try to identify where a problem area is, so your eyes can help a little bit listening. You should never skip really listening to what you're actually doing, but often it's really handy to have like an analyzer built in and see what's going on and what the incoming signal is, what the outgoing signal is. So that's a really nice feature of this kind of EQ. So I would like to show you like the three most used EQ types within this plugin. First of which would be the so-called low-cut filter. When I click in here, you can see by the curve that this is designed to cut off low frequencies. Or if I'm on the other side, this is a high cut filter, and as the name suggests, this is designed to cut off high frequencies. Let's listen to what that sounds like. So as you can hear, you can really cut off everything which is above a certain frequency with a high cut filter, and everything which is below a certain frequency with a low cut filter. And the parameters that you can tweak are the frequencies, so high sounds or lower sounds. So this ranges from roughly 20 to 20,000 hertz. And the other parameter is the so-called slope. So are we going to cut in a very gentle way, or are we going to cut in a very steep way? Usually the more gentle EQ curves sound more natural, but heavy cuts also have their place. The next most commonly used types of EQs are so-called shelf filters, and also these exist as low shelf and as a high shelf. And again, you have a certain frequency that you're choosing, and you either boost or cut above that frequency, or you boost or cut below that frequency. Let's listen to what that sounds like. So this is most often used to add a little bit of general brightness to a signal, or general low end information to a signal, or the opposite, cut slightly some high end or some low end. And finally, the third type of EQ that is most often used is a so-called bell EQ. And this is what it looks like. And as you can see, this has the shape of a bell. That's where the name is coming from. And also here you are choosing a frequency, a high frequency or low frequency. And again, the so-called Q factor, which tells you, are you working in a narrow area around the frequency, or are you working in a wider area around the frequency? So the higher the Q factor, the more narrow the area is, and the lower the Q factor, the wider the area is you're working around. And opposed to the shelf or cut filter, this one is working like symmetrically around the center frequency. Let's listen to what this sounds like. So this is used to get a little bit more surgical. Oftentimes you use this to maybe cut down a resonance that you have in a recording, or just boost a really precisely defined area in the frequency spectrum. Getting to know when and how to use an EQ takes a lot of practice, so be patient, play around with it. Maybe one playful way of learning to EQ is that you put in a piece of music and then draw in like a little EQ curve like so. And then you open up a second EQ right after the one that you just did, and then you try to undo what you did in the first plugin. And you play around with it until you feel that the sound is very natural and compares best to the same piece of music without any EQ at all. That would be a nice way to play around a little bit with it and get to know the tools. Okay, now let's move on to the more advanced EQ techniques that may be of use for you in the future. All right, let's talk about the first little EQ trick. We talked about having a low cut filter to remove some low end, which makes sense. But you can also use a low cut to enhance low end in a certain precise spot. And you think, what? That doesn't make any sense. I'm going to show you that it does make sense. The thing is, when you apply a low cut and go pretty steep, then a plugin as well as an actual hardware EQ is going to have a bump around the frequency that you are cutting off. This is coming from if you're using actual components to build a filter, then if you go pretty steep, then those components are naturally going to have a little boost around the frequency that you're actually cutting. Although some digital EQs remove that bump, on some you can enhance that bump, or you can use it to your advantage. I'm going to show you a little drum loop where I flattened out a little bit the low end, so it's a little bit weak on the low side, and we are going to use a low cut to put back in some energy into the kick drum. Let's listen to that. So the bass drum is pretty thin, right? Okay, we are grabbing our Pro Q3, put in a low cut with a high Q factor, which enhances the bump around the cutoff frequency. And now let's play around with it and see if we can get back in some bass drum. bypass. Okay, now you may think, yeah, why not just use a bell EQ and boost that low end? Well, you can do this, but this is different because since you still have the low cut, what this does is you're really only boosting this one little area and keeping all the low end really clean. And that is a huge bonus because if you just go in, for example, with a low shelf, then you may be boosting too much low end and just get a messy low end. Or if you're just using a bell EQ, it's still going to add a little bit more around an area where you don't necessarily want a boost. And this can really be very, very handy. So you just apply your low cut with a high Q factor and get a more surgical, precise little bump on that certain frequency without messing up the low end. This also brings me to another little thing that you have to be careful about. Because sometimes, let's say you apply a limiter to something and then you get some low frequency distortion that you can see in an analyzer and think, what the heck, I'm going to use a low cut just to get rid of the rumble, and suddenly your signal is clipping, although you're only just removing something. But the thing is, although it just looks like removing, you will always get a little bump in the lows when you apply a low cut. Let me show you this. I'm going to put a limiter on that drum so that it is pretty loud and hitting next to 0 dB. So now if we take our flat EQ, we are not going past 0 dB. And now I'm going to apply a low cut. And boom, we are clipping our signal, although we think we are only removing something. But even if this graph is not showing this bump around the cutoff frequency, we still have it. And that's the reason why we are clipping. So when you are low cutting and your signal is really close to 0 dB, just pay attention to the output meter of your EQ if you are not unintentionally clipping your signal. All right, the second, a little bit out of the ordinary EQ technique would be MS EQing, so mid-side EQing. I have a little example here of a little metal riff where I on purpose put the hi-hat a little bit too loud in the mix. So if now, for example, you would have to master this song and you have one element that is sitting somewhere in the mix on the side and it's a little bit too loud and annoying, there is not many ways that you can access this signal to pull it down, and one of which would be MS EQing. So MS means mid-side, so you can decide whether you're working on the signal that is in the middle or on the sides. MS comes from a certain mic technique where you use like a center microphone and then one microphone that is pointing in a figure eight to the sides, and you combine both to get basically one stereo signal. But you can decompose every stereo signal into its mid channel and its side channel and vice versa. And this is very handy if, for example, like in this case, you want to remove, let's say, a hi-hat that is sitting on the side without affecting anything else, let's say voice or bass drum or snare or anything that's sitting in the center. I'm going to show you this in a practical example, and then you know what I mean. So let's listen to that example first and listen to the hi-hat that is obviously too loud. Now let's open up a Pro Q3 and we're going to start with a normal bell EQ first. So the hi-hat is sitting somewhere here in the high frequency region around 10K. Now if I just go in and pull down that frequency range, I'm going to pull down everything else as well. The snare is getting dull, the guitars are getting dull. That's not what we want. But since the hi-hat is only sitting on one side, we can use this MS EQing to our advantage. So I will convert this from a stereo to a mid or side, in this case a side EQ, which means that it's only affecting the sides and leaves the center alone. And that is really brilliant because the snare is keeping all its snap because it's sitting in the center. The bass drum doesn't lose any attack because it's sitting in the center and has no business on the sides. So this is a really nice way to grab something that is sitting in a special place in the mix without affecting everything else. And here in this case, for example, you could automate this band to only pull down a little bit when the hi-hat is playing and just going back to zero when the hi-hat is not playing. That's at least what I would be doing if that was my problem and this was what I wanted to do. The next really interesting EQ technique is using a transient and or sustain EQ. I have one from the company Eventide that is called a split EQ, where you can access the transient and the sustain information independently and EQ only each or both of them. And this is really cool. Let me demonstrate you this, for example, on this bass drum. Let's listen to a little bass drum track first. Okay, the bass drum is fine, but let's say we want to enhance a little bit the attack of that bass drum. Of course, we could go in and just use an EQ. But the thing is, I can also hear a little bit of the snare wires getting louder, getting the room a little bit louder. What if I only want to enhance the kick portion, only the attack in the high end a little bit? That's when such a split EQ comes in really handy. That's the one. I'm going to set it to a bass drum mode, so it's detecting the kind of signal a little bit better. And now what we can do is we can either boost or cut either the transient portion of a signal or the sustain portion of a signal. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, now I'm only boosting the transient, which means the first quick attack of the signal. I can at the same time remove a little bit of the sustain to enhance more of the only boosting the transient part. If I bypass it, put it back in. If we compare this now to using an EQ, back to the split EQ, back to the normal EQ. If we use a regular EQ, we also boost the sustain, so it's getting instead of doof, doof, doof. And this is really brilliant. I can also, for example, use this on the low end. Let's say if I want to have like a sharp little attack in the low end and not so a boomy, sustainy low end. So boosting the transient portion, pulling down the tonal portion. If I bypass it, this gives you like a dry, low kick punch instead of if I just boost the low end, then it would get boomy and everything would just be woofy. And like this, you get like a short, snappy attack in the low end, which can come in really, really handy. Let's now assume you have like a rock track that you're working on and you're mastering it, and you cannot access the snare, for example, individually anymore, but you want to give it a little bit more crack, a little bit more attack. Then you can also use split EQ. Let's listen to this little example. Okay, let's go in where the snare has its attack, let's say around, yeah, 3, 4, 5, 6K, somewhere in the upper mids region, and we're just boosting the transient portion. Let me bypass it. So the snare gets really punchy without anything else getting affected. So all the guitars and stuff, they don't have a lot of attack. The bass drum may be getting a little bit more attack as well because it's sitting in the same range. But this is really a way to let you pull out the snare a little bit without really affecting the general tonal balance. Because if I was going to put in 6 dB of high end with an EQ, let's try what that sounds like. A regular EQ and not only one boosting the transient. Versus this. This is so much better result, because if I boost 6 dBs of highs on the complete mix, then it's just annoyingly harsh. But using only the attack portion, only the transient portion, and only EQ this one out, just lets a certain element, like in this case the snare, maybe a little bit the bass drum, pop out without affecting anything else. There are many, many ways that you can use this, and it's especially great if you have percussive material, or for example, where it comes in really handy is if you have like room microphones for a drum set where you don't want a lot of attack because you only want the sustainy part to give it like a reverb character. You can pull out a lot of transient information and boost the sustain information. The things that you can do with this, they are endless. So if we take the bass drum, for example, here, and we want to make it much softer, so instead of boosting anything, we are just going to cut out a little bit of transient. And if we want to cut out the transient but give it more room information, for example, to make it sound as if it was further away, I'm going to cut out the transient and boost the tonal information on the high end. It's a little bit exaggerated, but you get the drift. You can really move away that bass drum, for example, in the room by just manipulating different areas of the frequency range, working only on transient and on sustain. This tool is really worth gold. Okay, now to something which is really special. I call it harmonic EQing. No idea if that's the right word for it, but it's what I think it is. I'm going to use Melodyne, which is commonly used to tune different instruments or tune vocals, but Melodyne is also splitting up a signal into its harmonic structure. So basically fundamental and then first harmonic and blah, 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 going up into the highs. And you can use Melodyne to EQ a signal by not moving around basically a frequency range, but moving around a certain harmonic of that signal. So this is great. And what is even more crazy is that you can almost turn one signal into another, mimic the harmonic overtone structure, and let one instrument, for example, sound much closer to another instrument than to itself. A couple days ago, I recorded some trombone and some euphonium, which is basically like a baby tuba. They both have the same amount of notes that they can play, so they can play the same in the same register and re-recorded the same melody with both instruments, and they have a different sound. The trombone is more mid-focused and the euphonium is much warmer and softer. But now, using this harmonic EQing, I'm going to try and turn one into the other sonically. Listen to this. So this is the euphonium. This is the trombone. So they are in the same family of instruments, of course, but they sound completely different. The trombone has more mid-range, and the euphonium is really like buttery, velvety, very soft sounding. So now, if we're going to take both instruments and load them into Melodyne, and we are opening up the harmonic structure of those instruments. Here is the euphonium with a strong fundamental range, and then it's getting very soft, while the trombone has a little bit more of a bump in this harmonic area where the euphonium is already dropping down. Let's listen again to both. And the trombone. So now, first of all, if I'm going to euphonium, what I can do is, for example, here you have this little slider where you can move up. It's called brilliance. You can move it up or down. Let's see what that does. And this is not the same as just putting high end on the signal. This is really like enhancing the higher harmonic content of that instrument. So it's moving, basically, if the notes are going up, then the harmonics are going up as well. So you basically have an EQ that is moving along with the change of the notes, which is pretty cool to use. But this is not the really amazing thing that you can do with this. But watch this. We take the euphonium, copy the spectrum information, and paste it into the trombone. Listen to the trombone now. This is the euphonium. This is the trombone. They almost sound identical. So this can come in handy if you're using it in a very creative way. Maybe try to superimpose the harmonic structure of a piano onto a guitar, or the other way around. Or like in this case, if you say, yeah, you played one part of a melody with a trombone, the other with the euphonium, and you want to match them a little bit more, and you, of course, you can try to EQ it, but using this, that is like a sorcery almost. So the trombone now sounds like this, and if I remove what we just did, it just completely changed the character of the instrument, and the possibilities that you have here, they are basically endless. Sometimes I also use this if you have an instrument that just has like one harmonic that's always poking out and really annoying you. Yeah, you can also go in and basically do this. You can really access the different harmonics by just, yeah, dragging them around, putting them up, putting them down. You also have like a complete EQ section here where you see basically another view of the harmonic structure of whatever you feed into Melodyne, and you can use this as an EQ. Let's try that. And And as I said, this is not like regular EQing where you just boost or cut low end, because this harmonic structure is going to move up and down as the instrument is playing. If it's going an octave higher and playing something high, then the harmonics are going to move up or down with the signal. An EQ is not going to do this. There is something, I think it was called surf EQ, that did something similar, just following the notes, and the EQ bands that you were using were just following the melody. But this is on another level, so can really go crazy with this. Okay, using the harmonic structure cloning to match one signal to another is one way to do it, but sometimes you just want to, let's say, let one bass drum sound like another bass drum, or one snare a little bit more than another snare, or just match two tracks a little bit. And there you have the function called match EQ that you can, for example, use in FabFilter's Pro Q3. Let's see what we can do with our example of just now with the trombone and the euphonium if we try to match one to the other. Let's see what happens. Here we have the euphonium. I'm going to send that signal to a bus pre-fader. This is bus 1. And now what we're going to do is on the trombone, we are going to put in Pro Q3 and choose this bus 1 as input of the sidechain bus. So what we now can do is we go to this setting down here, and there is a function called EQ match. And if I hit that, I can choose what the reference will be to match my signal to. And I'm going to select external sidechain, which means that this EQ is now going to listen to the incoming signal on this bus 1. And on this bus 1, the incoming signal is the euphonium. So basically the EQ is listening to the euphonium and is going to try and match the EQ curve of that euphonium and paste it onto the trombone. Let's see how that works. So basically you play the piece that you want to match, you play it a couple times, let the EQ listen to the incoming signal and try to adapt the curve, and then you hit finish, and then this is what you get. If I bypass it, in this case, since the two instruments are very close to one another, so they are from the same family of instruments, that's really working pretty nicely. This is sounding almost exactly as the euphonium now, although it was a completely different instrument. And this also works well if you have, let's say, a bass drum sound that you really like, and you have your sample or whatever, and you say, I want to match it to the other sample, but I don't know how, then you can at least try with this match EQ and get some kind of direction. Sometimes it's notching a little bit widely, like here, for example, it's putting on a very steep notch. Maybe I would not do this. It's getting a little bit strange sounding if you have too many notch filters. But you get a good direction into what your sound is missing in regard to the incoming signal of the reference sound that you are listening to. So it's an amazing feature that come in really, really handy. And this is also working well, for example, if you had the same singer sing maybe through two different microphones or on two different days with the voice being a little bit different. You really can use basically your reference track and feed it into this EQ and try it to match the previous take. That's really, it can come in really, really handy if you really need to closely match two signals. All right, let's talk about a special application of EQ for one special task. And this is using an EQ in the sidechain path of a compressor. Not every compressor can do this. You may have heard of this. Some compressors have that feature built in that you can say, for example, don't listen to the low end while you're deciding how to compress. But some compressors, like, for example, FabFilter's Pro C, you can engage a complete EQ in the sidechain path of the compressor. So you can say, hey, listen a little bit more to the high end or listen a little bit more to the low end while deciding how to react to a signal. And I'm going to show you one special application where this comes in really, really handy. And this is when compressing vocals. Because what often happens is, first of all, when you record vocals, you have an excess of like transients, like the consonants, the T's are very sharp, the S's are very sharp, and the more you compress, the worse it often gets, because sometimes the compressor is just not quick enough to react really quickly and catch all those T's. So although sometimes even if you put on a very fast attack time, it's reacting as quickly as it can, but still it's not really catching all those T's and S's and K's and all that stuff that has a lot of high-end information. And what I really like to do is to soften those consonants is applying some high EQ into the sidechain path of the compressor so that the compressor is reacting very quickly to high-end information, so high frequency content, like for example in T's, and thus reacting much quicker to those consonants and resulting in a much smoother compression of the vocals. I'm going to show you a little example. Here we have a little snippet of a vocal.
You're driving through the dark into the morning.
Okay, now we have here,
Into the morning.
for example, this T here.
Into the morning.
I have a compressor already installed here.
Into the morning. Into the morning. Into the morning. Into the morning.
And it's, although it's set to a very quick attack time,
Into the morning.
it's not really catching that T really quickly. It's reacting more to the body of the vocal and not so much to the high-end information. But now here we can put in a sidechain. I already prepared this, where I boosted like the high end of the signal that the compressor is listening to.
Into the morning.
Now I have already to go back with the threshold.
Into the morning.
You can already see how quickly it's reacting now to the T, because I boosted the area in which this T is happening.
Into the morning. Into the morning. Into the morning.
Let's listen to the whole phrase.
You're driving through the dark into the morning.
And if I put down the sidechain,
you're driving through the dark into the morning.
So especially the consonants, the T is really poking out a little bit, but by applying some sidechain compression, you're really letting the compressor listen more to that frequency range and reacting much quicker to this. And this, in this example, it's handy to get rid a little bit of that sharp T, but you can use this as well. Maybe if you have like, I don't know, a bass guitar where you have some fret noise and you want the compressor to react a little bit quicker to the fret noise, or just the other way around. You don't want it to react to the fret noise, but only to the fundamental note of the bass. So you can, for example, then remove some information in the sidechain path of the fret noise. So cut, I don't know, between 500 and 2K, where you have all the from the frets. So if you remove this, the compressor is not hearing that anymore and only reacting to the low end information. So you can really, teach your compressor what to listen to by EQing the sidechain path. That's very, very powerful. All right, now one of my favorite EQ tricks is not using an EQ as an EQ, but using saturation as EQ. I mean, what is that? Well, if you use saturation, what then happens is that saturator is adding harmonic content into what's already there. So if you now Imagine taking a multi-band saturation tool such as Saturn from FabFilter, for example, where you can make multiple bands and apply different amounts of saturation to different frequency regions. What you, for example, can do is zoom in on a part that you would normally EQ, but then instead of just boosting that region, boosting what's already there, you are adding in extra content within that region. So you are enhancing or making that section louder, but with, let's say, new and fresh material that has not been there before. So you are adding density in a certain frequency range instead of just adding volume. I'm going to show you with one of my favorite applications for this is on shakers. I like to use shakers in like acoustic arrangements, but I don't like those small egg shakers that have no substance. It's just like tick, 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 tick. But I want it more like and adding saturation to the mids of such a signal is really an incredibly great trick to get thickness into a shaker without just boosting that area. I'm going to show you what I mean. Let's listen to this shaker for a second. It sounds okay, but it could be thicker. I like it when such a shaker has some meat. So what we are going to do, we are going to add Saturn. I'm going to remove all drives so that it's basically flat. Okay, the high end, I want to leave that alone. That's fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add like a mid-band, leaving the high end alone, and the low end, we don't care. There is nothing going on there in the shaker anyway, and I don't want anything being going on down there. So we are focusing on the mid-range here. Now I'm going to select some, gentle saturation. That's working fine. And then I'm going to increase the drive. So you can hear it's starting filling up that mid-range with some, crunchy, nice, thick mids that have not been there before. I bypass it and engage it back in. So I'm using saturation as EQ basically. Yeah, and I would say, you could do the same with an EQ, but let's try and do it and see how both are different. Both can be fine, but it's something else. So let's take a copy of that track and we are going to use an EQ instead. So this is basically the same area that we are working on before. Let's compare. The thing with EQ is that I think it's more annoying. It's just boosting what has been there before, and I don't like these mids too much. They are a little bit honky. But if you are adding in new harmonics that have not been there before, by increasing the density of that part instead of just making it louder, it just doesn't sound so honky and so EQ'd somewhat. It's sounding much more natural and more pleasing, and increasing the density also really helps placing it in the mix. It's you just gain loudness, and you don't need to put up the signal so loud in the mix, and it still cuts through a dense mix because you just have this density on the individual signals. So give this a go. Multi-band saturation, focus on an area that you want to enhance, and go and add in some harmonics in that region instead of just boosting that region. And I will guarantee that this will come in handy in a lot of signals. Okay, next little bit more special EQing technique is what I want to refer to as spectral EQing. Let's listen to a little snippet of a vocal, identify the problem, and then I'm going to show you what I mean by this.
Get set, here, ready.
This ready has a harshness that I don't like. It's a little bit abrasive on the ears, and I want to soften that out a little bit. Well, we could grab an EQ and remove the frequency that is a little bit abrasive and automate this or render this in, but there is another way to do this, and I would really like to use spectral editing for stuff like this, especially if it's like just certain spots that appear that need some attention and not the track in general. So, and this is really like one syllable out of that complete phrase. So why not go in and fix this right in the source material? So I'm going to send that little portion here to RX11, which is a spectral editor. And here we can see this is exactly the region that has this harshness in the upper mids or the highs, or however you want to call that region. So let's go in and attenuate that part a little bit, especially this one is poking out a little bit, and we certainly have a little bit around, yeah, the 4K region, this harshness. Now I'm sending it back, render it in. You can already see a little change in the waveform, but now let's listen to it.
Get set, here, ready.
Instead of,
Ready.
it's much softer now. And since we already put it in right into the source material, we don't need to worry about any automation or anything else. This is really a quick fix, and it works wonders. This also works really well if, for example, you're playing a guitar in a room that is not correctly treated and you have some resonance. Sometimes some notes, they just build up and poke out a little bit, especially in the lows. So you can go in with spectral editing and just appease those resonances a little bit. And one big advantage is also that if you're using some compression afterwards, that you don't have some poking out resonance that are going to trigger a compressor, for example, and letting compressor pump. You can really clean up your track a little bit in certain spots up front, so you have a clean track to work with. The compressor is not going to go crazy with every resonance, and it just sounds better. And you don't have to think about, yeah, automation or anything like this. You just go through, you hear a problem, I'm quickly spectral editing it in, and you're good to go. You can also, on parts like these, use dynamic EQ, like, for example, one mode that, for example, Pro Q4 is offering, which is also called like spectral mode. If I put in this EQ, I can see the harshness range is around here. So I put up a band and make it spectral. So you have a dynamic mode, and the spectral mode is basically like the even finer resolution dynamic mode that is really working magic. So I make it spectral, and now this band is basically listening to the material and reacting in a dynamic way. I'm going to set it to a pretty fine resolution, which is here called spectral density, which then is working with fine notch filters instead of broader strokes. Let's see what that does.
Set, here, ready.
So you can see it's also taming that harshness in a pretty nice way. But yeah, maybe you risk to also catch some high end that you didn't necessarily want to catch. So this is if it has to be quick and also working pretty well. So dynamic EQing, you can do this or with a plugin called Soothe. It's doing a similar thing, behaving a little bit different, but doing a similar job. So if it has to be quick, then something that is just living on the track. And if you have a little bit more time and want to go a little bit more into detail, I would suggest give a go at spectral editing and just fixing certain spots that are bothering you and just cleaning up basically the raw material. I love to do this, and it has served me very, very well. Okay, now a very special advanced application of this spectral EQing that we just talked about. So I have here a death metal song that I mixed not so long ago, and the voice has a little bit of hard time cutting through the guitars. So what I wanted to do is I'm going to use an EQ on the guitars that is supposed to carve out some space for the voice, but only when the vocal is actually singing. So how am I going to do this? I'm going to send the vocal to an aux bus. So, and then the EQ on the guitar is going to listen to that vocal and only reacting to the vocal. So we are going to put in a dynamic band, like a spectral band, how it's called in that Pro Q4. And this is only going to pull down the same frequencies as the vocal is producing. And by doing this, it's giving exactly the right amount of space to the voice to cut through when the voice is singing. So you have the guitar, and always when the voice is singing, it's going to pull down the voice frequencies a little bit, making space for the vocal. That's really a brilliant application for this kind of spectral EQing. Let's listen to a piece of that song without any processing, and I'm going to show you that processing.
Profound of human spirit, request for silence, engine for
Yeah, so that low voice really has a hard time against all those guitars, but I don't want to put the voice too loud or the guitars too low, so let's carve some space. So the voice is going out to a bus that I've called vocal to guitar sidechain. This is pre-fader, so we can listen to the guitar in solo, and the cue on that guitar is listening to the voice, although we don't listen to the voice itself. Now I have a band here that is in spectral mode, and the input of the EQ is set to this bus that's coming from the vocal. So this band is now listening to the voice. Now I solo the guitar, and I'm going to demonstrate it in extreme that you can really see and hear what that EQ is doing. I exaggerate it now a little bit. If you do it too much, then it's getting too artificial. But you can see that every time when the vocal is singing, the same frequencies as the vocal is producing are getting pulled down from the guitar, making space for the voice. I have this on the 2 guitar tracks, so it's 2 times doubled guitars, and we have this on both tracks. And let's see what that does for us.
profound of human spirit, request for silence, profound of human spirit, request for silence, engine forces intertwined, cosmic grand designs, through the crimson well of black chaos holds its throne, with trembling hands we grasp the void.
The voice is having an easier time cut through because the guitar is making space for the voice, and as you could see, it's really only reacting when the singer is singing. And this is also working, for example, if you're using a lead guitar that has to cut through a rhythm guitar, because most of the time what you would do is, yeah, pull back the rhythm guitars a little bit to make some space for the lead guitar. But doing this is you just don't lose so much volume or so much density, because it's just like, yeah, the two signals are working in perfect sync together. It's always just making space exactly where needed and just coming back right after it, so you don't lose the volume or the intensity, and everything is working nicely together. That's really a brilliant way to, yeah, use this spectral EQing. All right, just one more example of EQ technique that is maybe not what you would expect if we're talking about using EQs. And what I mean by that is using your microphone as an EQ. I guess you know it, but I just want to demonstrate this just to make it obvious how much microphone position can change the sound, even if you're using it on the same instrument at roughly the same spot. Just the angle at which a microphone is looking at the source makes a huge difference. So, of course, you can also use just different microphone ribbons sound darker, so they have basically like a built-in EQ that is rolling off top end. If you're using a condenser, it may be a little bit brighter, a different kind of bright than a dynamic microphone. But now let's assume that you have one microphone and you just play around with the positioning. I'm going to show you a little example by just recording a snare drum with one microphone, quick and dirty. I'm just going to check out a couple different positions, and then we are going to listen to the result. All right, I'm going to show you what I mean with one simple example. We're just going to record a snare drum with one microphone, and I'm going to choose a couple different positions and don't change any setting at all except the position of the microphone. And then we are going to listen to the sonic differences. I'm going to start with the microphone completely perpendicular to the drum head. Okay, next I'm going for an angle of around 45 degrees to the head. Next, we're going for a very shallow angle. And finally, we are going to move a little bit further away. Up. Just like so. Okay, that was now a quick run through. Now let's listen to those examples in a little bit more detail and see how different they sound and why they do this. Okay, the first example that we had was basically recording the snare at a very steep angle, almost perpendicular to the snare head, which often results in having a little bit more low end, maybe a little bit more ring, because you're really picking up the ring of the rim of the snare drum. And also you get, a little bit less high end because you're really focusing on one little aspect of that snare drum instead of recording it in full. So let's listen to that in solo quickly. It has a ring kung, 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 that we don't have on the other recordings as much. Now let's listen to the microphone in like a 45 degrees position. Back to the steep. Back to 45. So different sound, different sound. Now at the very shallow angle, much more brightness. This is a good trick if you using snare drum and, for example, you always used to record a little bit more perpendicular to the drum head, and you always get a lot of hi-hat bleed into your snare microphone, and then by cranking the high end because you don't have enough high end from the recording, you even exaggerate the bleed of the hi-hat into your microphone. Yeah, just go for a steeper angle. You will have naturally more high end, and you don't need to crank high end with an actual EQ, and thus you are not exaggerating the bleed from the hi-hat into the snare. So use the positioning of the microphone as your basic EQ and avoid further problems. Let's again compare the perpendicular to the very shallow angle. It's the same volume, but so much more high end. It sounds more natural. No need to crank anything in post-processing. And now let's listen to the distant microphone. 4 different sounds just by a quick adjustment of the microphone angle. And this does not only apply to snare. I just wanted to use this as an example now, but take this, for example, on an acoustic guitar. If you aim your microphone towards the sound hole, you will get a boomy low end, a lot of low end. If you're going a little bit more towards the fretboard, you will get more high end, a little bit less boominess. If you go more under, on the underside of the strumming hand, for example, you will get a lot of resonance from the actual wood of an acoustic guitar, different sounds. So moving around like a couple centimeters sometimes makes a huge difference. So I strongly want to encourage you to play around with this. Don't just stick a microphone somewhere and then think, hey, I'm going to EQ and fix this later when it's time to mix. Take the couple minutes to, AB or ABC a couple different microphone positions, and you will be surprised how much you can pull out of the raw recording already. Okay, that was it. That was a lot of different aspects of EQing, some more conventional, some hopefully a little bit less conventional. I hope that it triggers some inspiration for you to play around with different tools and try to apply some of these techniques in your productions. I hope there is something of use for you. If you enjoy this type of video, have a look at all the other videos that I have on my channel. There's next to 100 videos already, and I try to come up with more stuff as time goes by. Leave me a comment. I really always enjoy reading your comments. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and I hope to see you in another video. Bye-bye.